So good evening and welcome to this International Center for Moral Injury, or ICMI, webinar. My name is Brian Powers. I'm the Executive Director of the International Center for Moral Injury.
So it's my pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Timothy Mallard. Timothy.
Thank you very much, Brian. Let me begin with several words of thanks. First, to everyone who's on this presentation today. Thank you for your time and your interest in these topics, and for your willingness to listen to me, but to engage in critical dialogue. I'm deeply cognizant that everyone here could have been doing something else today, but you chose to be here, and I'm thankful for your presence. And thank you to Brian and to Jane and the ICMI, without whose support I couldn't have written this book this past year. The ICMI, I think, has chartered itself for at least one goal of, amongst many, of creating intellectual capital, and there's a very real sense in which this book is the production of the fruitful collaboration that I was able to experience in the ICMI. So I'm grateful to Brian and Jane, both for hosting this meeting, but also for their ongoing support and friendship and colleagueship in studying moral injury. I'm also thankful to Dr. Michael Snape and to Canon Professor Simon Oliver of the Department of Theology and Religion, as well as Professor Dr. Margaret Masson at St. Chad's College. Both of these institutions, the Department of Theology and Religion and St. Chad's College at Durham University, were absolutely vital in both mine and Sharon's lives this past year, and we're honored to be able to give back even something small like a presentation like this to recognize their work and how critical they were to us. So thank you to all these people. And lastly, I might say one other thing in terms of a personal word of thanks to Dean Philip Fleming and the staff at Durham Cathedral. I imagine they're not on, but the worshiping community at Durham Cathedral also proved extremely generative for both of us this past year while we lived in Durham. And now that we've returned to the United States, we miss it quite a bit. But thank you to all these people. Well, it's my pleasure to be able to present for a short time today, and then hopefully reserve the balance of our time for dialogue about a book that, in a real sense, was an expression of my love, and I say that in the Christian sense, for the profession of arms, for the soldiers and families with whom I was able to serve, as Brian said, for many decades in the United States Army, but also for the colleagues I had in both the profession of military chaplaincy and in the profession of arms in many other nations, including the United Kingdom, France, Great Britain, Germany. And this book was really an expression of an amalgamation of thoughts that was pulled together over many years. As Brian said, part of my background, which is a little bit different, is that I was a certified Army strategist, so I was only the second chaplain in the United States Army to achieve that designation. And that has really, I don't think, anything to do with me so much as it does the fact that the Army for quite some time did not recognize the role of religion in strategic thinking, and has only begun to recently do that. So in a very real sense, I think about this from a different way, and perhaps from a different vantage point. And the book is written really at the strategic level. You see that captured in the central idea here, that moral and spiritual injury are now internal wounds of war that impact not only warriors, but also their families, communities, forces, and nations. So the book really is set in the context of the profession of arms, but I hope to be able to make the case that the principles that I elucidate in it can be applied in other contexts and settings as well. By the way, I will say that I've included both my website and email down on the bottom, so if anybody would like to have further contact or dialogue with me, you're welcome to write me at that email address. So probably the key thing I want to begin with was, why did I write this book? And as you can imagine, as an Army chaplain or as a padre, I repeatedly saw these wounds in the people with whom I served and whom I served in my decades in military ministry. I must say that, however, I write in the book that, and this is a quotation from the book, I own the wounds of which I write. And in a very real sense, I lived these also as the son of an Army chaplain who served in Vietnam from 1969 to 1970. So while not wanting to make the book solely about my own experience, I was able to see that my experience mirrored quite a bit the soldiers and families whom I served. And yet I wanted to give a hopeful move toward a different framing about suffering, which often seems purposeless. From a theological perspective, I wanted to begin to posit a new paradigm of redemptive suffering. And I am already framing out a book on that. So that's the next project that I have. Also, I began to see, however, that these wounds were becoming a trend across the profession of arms in our nation. So I wanted to raise awareness of these injuries, particularly at the strategic level of national security policymaking. So as Brian said, I'm a trained Christian ethicist, particularly a just war Christian ethicist, an ethicist in the just war tradition. So I'm extremely grateful that the dialogue that we have within the ICMI is so fruitful and generative. That, as Brian mentioned, that is always in evidence at our annual conferences and in these webinars. But in the profession of arms before I retired, I began to hear more and more this term moral injury used, and particularly by leaders at the strategic level of the force, but often without specificity or without a sense of understanding in terms of context. So I also hoped to be able to raise this to a different level of discussion within the profession. And lastly, I wanted to begin reasserting the voice of pastoral theology in the contemporary profession of arms, and also within the American public in terms of its civil-military relationships. There's a very real sense in which pastoral theology has lost its voice within the profession of arms, and I think that that's for a variety of reasons. Perhaps if somebody's interested in that, we might touch on that in the Q&A. But nonetheless, I believe that pastoral theology has a role to play in the profession of arms and should begin to comment on those things in which it has a warrant. So this book is at least some small attempt to do that. That said, I think it's always important for you as a reader or any reader to be able to know what the assumptions were that underlay this work. What were the things that I either held at the implicit and hopefully at the explicit level that undergirded this? Well, as I mentioned, I served as an Army chaplain, and so there's a very real sense in which that I cannot claim objectivity in my thinking or in my writing. In a very real sense, in the ways that I experienced my career, I experienced both moral and spiritual injury in some very profound ways, as did my family. So I can't claim to be objective about this or these topics, but nonetheless, I hope to be honest about my subjectivity and to put that forward at the beginning of the work. Necessarily, then, this is a work of pastoral theology, and as opposed to academic theology. But I also am trying to speak from a respectfully pluralistic Christian theological frame of reference. That is, I hope that the way that I write in the book, particularly in terms of my infusion of theological ideals, is representative of the broadest tenets within the Judeo-Christian tradition, and yet creates space for people of other confessional stances to find touch points of agreement or perhaps even disagreement with the work. So this also was an assumption that underlay this work, and you as the reader deserve to know that. Third, I have made the contention, and perhaps I've overstated it, but I believe in being, I think, fairly clear about my thinking. And that is that clinical thinking, I believe, has for far too long dominated the discourse around moral and spiritual injury. And this has had immense derivative impacts on topics like funding and where the research dollars lie, what the topics of study are or debate, how we think about healing modalities and treatment of those who suffer from these, and even derivatively the nature of human personhood. Now, I have made this contention, again, as an ethicist within the profession of arms, that there's a very real sense in which the question of human personhood is being, I think, diluted within the profession of arms. That is our understanding of it, and I think in some senses, not solely, but in some senses, the clinical hegemony around moral injury has added to that dilution of the nature of human personhood, understanding that within the profession of arms. Fourth, I think that the current wars in both Eastern Europe and the Near and Middle East will have enormous impact on future war, particularly on continental Europe and in the South and East China Seas. You'll notice, and I do title it Russo-Ukraine and Israel-Iran, but here I have purposefully taken this sort of strategic perspective that the wars that are currently still in processes of active combat or ceasefire can't be, in terms of a strategist perspective, limited only to Eastern Ukraine or to Gaza. Rather, they are really regional in nature, and in a very real sense, the strategic competition has been between Russia and, in Europe, Russia and Ukraine, as well as the rest of the NATO nations, and in the Middle East, it's been certainly between Israel and Iran, with other major nation states as players in that. Nonetheless, how these wars end will have immense impacts on the future of war, particularly in continental Europe and the South and East China Seas. And unfortunately, I believe those types of wars are coming. And again, we might get to that in the Q&A if someone wishes. And then finally, a central assumption of my work is that the just war tradition, I believe, can play a singularly reinforcing role at the nation state and level in terms of employing guardrails that help the profession achieve human flourishing and establish just peace. And that has been in the news this week, certainly here in the United States. And again, I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. I'll be doing some work with some other people in the strategic and just war space in the next week publicly on that. I won't be able to comment today on that. But nonetheless, the just war tradition, I believe, has an incredibly important role to help us think through how moral and spiritual injury can be ameliorated at the strategic level of war in future war. So those are some of the assumptions that underlie this work. What are the central questions that I was seeking to ask? Well, an answer. Ontologically, does a warrior possess, or are they, a soul? Some obviously theological traditions contend that a person doesn't possess a soul, they are a soul. Pardon me. Nonetheless, I think that this is a paradigmatic question that the profession of arms cannot avoid any longer. It's been presumed for centuries, really, but in the last, I would say, 60 to 70 years, this has been a question of great debate within the profession of arms, and frankly, the clinical professions have I think tilted the balance of, again, our understanding around this ontological issue, so that when we think about healing from moral injury, or we think about healing maybe even from spiritual injury, often you'll see it framed only in categories of physical health or mental health, sometimes emotional health, certainly. But it's almost as if we have no category to begin to understand the wounding of the soul and how it can be incorporated into a more holistic understanding of healing. Secondly, if a warrior does possess a soul, what is the derivative impact of this reality on the profession of arms? And here I'm thinking particularly of issues like trust, morale, leadership, and really I think we begin to see here the criticality of the work of early thinkers like Jonathan Shea, who helped focus our attention so much on how the breaking of trust in military formations was really a function of poor leadership, and yet that had incredibly important derivative effects, secondary, tertiary, on morale, and then on the individual soldiers who came home from war later. So far from being a question of no or small import, I think this is a question of immense import. And by the way, I think we begin to see that this can have an impact on not only the individual warrior, but also the military unit, the formation, as Shea famously talked about, that they represent a type of moral entity within and of themselves as a whole, as an aggregate. Third, then, basically, and probably one might ask, just looking at the title, how does one define spiritual injury, and is it both similar yet distinct from moral injury? In some of my earlier writing, I've termed these the twin children of the Great War from World War I, but one could arguably make the case that they're the twin children of any war. And yet, as any parent of twins will affirm, each of those twins they're a unit of the pair, but they are distinct as persons. And I think both moral and spiritually are similar, yet distinct as well. How does this then, and how does our thinking then, and the next question, further impact the multiple relationships of the warrior, or how do those relationships help us broaden our thinking about these? And these include relationships both personal and professional, and yet I want to contend as well temporal and eternal as well. And then finally, how does this, or should this, impact a nation state's ethical decision making about going to war? Right? Do we advocate for incorporating our understanding of these critical maladies, these internal injuries of moral and spiritual injury, into the calculus of a nation state in terms of going to war? Because it will certainly be a cost that a nation state will pay, perhaps for decades to come. But we'll talk about that more in a minute. So, what is moral injury? What is spiritual injury? Well, as you can see, there's multiple definitions, and I point out in the book, Brian is more the expert on the vast literature around the specificity of moral injury. Here I've just captured in aggregate the two principal concepts of either betrayal or violation, and one will see connotations there with Jonathan Shea or Shira Magan or Brett Litz or other later clinical scholars. But I say a betrayal or violation of deeply held core values, principles, or beliefs in a person or group, and that's my contribution to this. And this can be both individual and communal. I think it's often described really as a wound principally of the mind, but this is either singular or collective. A wound of emotional disequilibrium, that is negative moral emotions, and Brian and our definition from the ICMI capture this. A person can have moral injury and turn those emotions inwardly on themselves, or they can turn those emotions outwardly on others. But it's also, I think, a wound of deep ethical dissonance. I do make the specific case in the book that I believe moral injury is also a continual, perhaps even a perpetual process of negative moral and ethical reflection. And in any, if you take any of these as substantive for the definition, I think that one can see for someone suffering from moral injury, one of the things that happens within that person's life, and maybe even again collectively for a nation state for a time, is it turns the focus backward in time. In a very real sense, the focus of the person becomes locked on the past, perhaps questioning the present, but often without an ability to look towards a possibility of a new future. What is spiritual injury? I describe this here in the book. I had had a different definition earlier in some of my writing. I refined it for this book. I defined it as a deep wounding of the soul arising from life-altering trauma, misbalancing one's core sense of self, and threatening one's relationships to others and God. So I make the ontological leap here that this is a wound principally of the soul. I do believe that soldiers and warriors and people have or are a soul again, and even nations have a soul to a very great degree, and that spiritual injury is a type of wounding of that soul, but that is different than a wounding of the mind in my thinking. It's seen, or perhaps descriptively able to be described as a wound of concentric effect on vital relationships, and I think radiating outward. So moving from the individual to the unit to the family to community, people groups, nation states, and then ultimately to God. By the way, I want to commend the work of Asala Katache. She really helped both the ICMI and me professionally understand critically the focus on people groups and how people groups experience moral injury, but also capture that in terms of artistic expressions, and then also seek healing as a group as well. Nonetheless, I think spiritual injury is a type of concentric effect, wounding outward from the person. Although I will say, I must admit, Asala is specifically talking about moral injury having this, but I see spiritual injury as having the same type of effect on people groups. And then it's a wound best described by 8 markers. Some of those are understanding genuine evil, wrestling with paralyzing existential doubt, and inability to forgive God, perhaps to forgive themselves. I go into greater depth in the book on these 8 markers, so I won't belabor them here, but you can take a look at those later. Nonetheless, again, you can see the similarities, but perhaps I hope the distinctions here in just this brief synopsis. Why are these wounds a problem for any nation at the strategic level? Well, as I've said, they are both moral and spiritual injury are often both pervasive to the core of a person, both body and soul, and they are persistent over the whole of life. I think that this is one of the things that early efforts to help people wrestle with moral injury, such as Jonathan Shea and his clients, or Larry Dewey or others, we're watching in real time with the clients sitting in front of them, people who were, as I have termed it before, who had long since left the battlefield, but the battlefield had never left them. Right. So they and this type of injury, these types of injuries went to the very heart of who they were as a person. And in fact, in a real sense, that became much of the problem for them. They could not refocus or answer in a fresh way questions around identity, meaning, or purpose in the light of their experience of moral injury or spiritual injury. And here they were decades later now, in some cases, still wrestling with these same problems long after the physical wounds of war had healed. And in my contention, this imposes an immense opportunity cost of war far beyond the battlefield that I think nations are wise strategically to attend to. Opportunity cost, of course, is an economic term, but it basically connotes that when one in economics spends one's money or resources on one thing, good or service, there's an opportunity cost of what you can't spend it on elsewhere. And I believe that the warriors that serve in our professions of arms are a limited resource of immense value. I contend of eternal value, and that they and their woundedness presents an opportunity cost. And are we as nations prepared to consider that cost before we go to war? These injuries then are thus both necessarily individual and communal, and reflexively, however, so is their potential for healing. Derivatively, and I think one can very easily see, and certainly many nations that have gone, well, all nations that went through the pandemic can see that they're applicable not only to the profession of arms, but also to other vocations and experiences. And I was privileged, as I taught a course on this at the United States Army War College, to repeatedly have students who were willing, I think very courageously, to talk about the painful burdens of these injuries that they had, some of them had carried with them for decades. In terms of violations of their interior codes, their core values, principles, and beliefs, their questions about God and where God was in their life relative to experiences of sexual trauma, racism, domestic violence, but certainly within the profession of arms in terms of battlefield experiences. Sometimes not even battlefield experiences, experiences in peacetime that called into question whether they had compromised their own belief systems or what God was doing through those experiences for them. Obviously, I think most of us can see that COVID-19 and the pandemic provided a critical focal point for understanding, even beyond the profession of arms, moral and spiritual injury and their effects on people and entire nations, and certainly the profession of healthcare. So how do the wars in Ukraine and Israel illustrate these problems at the strategic level of national security? Well, first in the book, I contend that both of these wars re-illustrate both the timeless concepts of the nature of war and the character of war. Scholars about war will talk about the nature of war, things that do not change. As an example, of course, the great Prussian theorist Karl von Clausewitz very famously said, war is an extension of politics by other means. There's a very real sense in which war that always illustrates that as a truism. That's really endemic to the nature of war. You can take some of the other principles of war, such as mass, maneuver, fires, those things winning battles, those things do not change. But the character of war often does change, and that's often attenuated by changes in context, aims, ideologies, technologies. So both of these conflicts are re-illustrating for us that the nature of war and the character of war are enduring ways of understanding or thinking about war. Some things about them indicate that war has not changed. Many things about them indicate that war is changing quite rapidly, and we can certainly talk about those more in the Q&A. I'll touch on those in just a minute, and particularly, by the way, relative to the issue of technology. One of the contentions I make in the book is that values, principles, and beliefs are often a casualty of war, and they must be collectively rediscussed and revalidated. An example I make in the book, and locating it within both of these conflicts, is that of non-combatant immunity. Really came up in the just war tradition in the 20th century, in the early to mid 20th century, as wars increasingly involved not just force on force, but force on force and civilian combatants who were often trapped in the middle of conflicts. Wars moved from battlefields into and around civilian population centers. And there's a very real sense in which these current wars illustrate that, in fact, these types of population centers can be what we term in military tactics a center of gravity to be attacked or defended. Nonetheless, I think in a very real sense, our collective values, principles, and beliefs often become a casualty of war, perhaps without thought or perhaps without reflection ahead of time, and so they must be rediscussed and revalidated. And as an example, again, this question of non-combatant immunity is right here on the front pages of things going on in the United States this week with United States actions in the Southern Command area of operations. So I think in a very real sense, surfacing these discussions about what we believe in terms of values, principles, beliefs, and by the way, I make the distinction in the book that these three things are not synonymous. They're very different in terms of ethics, but nonetheless I aggregate them because they usually form the moral core of an individual and or a nation, and in terms of helping them decide about what they will fight or defend. And these things have to be rediscussed and revalidated, I think, at a social level as well as an individual level. Sorry, I've had a bit of a see if that works. There we go. I talked about opportunity cost, and I contend that a nation's sons or daughters are its most precious resource. And these are not only uniformed members of the profession of arms, but any member of a future generation. And the injuries from them, however, in the profession of arms wound them not only during but also long after conflict has ceased, as I said a minute ago. As a result, I think nations who employ a profession of arms have a sacred duty to steward their growth and flourishing to help their societies recover from the ravages of war. I spoke a minute ago about Jonathan Shea and other clinicians working early on with the veterans of the Vietnam War. Many people may not know in the American context, there's a very real sense that even though we had tremendous amounts of veterans after the American Civil War and the United States government, the Union government early on, and later the United States government began to apply resources at the federal level to these veterans for pensions or for land purchases, things like that. But in a very real sense, the United States really only began to come to grips with the fact that there was an opportunity cost in terms of what its soldiers had experienced in war when the Veterans Administration, the Department of Veterans Affairs, was established in 1976 as a cabinet level position. My former friend and late friend and colleague Max Cleland was a triple amputee from Vietnam, and he was the first secretary of that, appointed by President Carter. And in a very real sense, it was that began to catalyze within the conscience of the American populace that there was a lingering cost of war that would have to be paid for many years. Finally, I think that these wars in both Eastern Europe and the Near and Middle East show that nation-state war is the paradigm for the next 10 to 20 years. If we had any sort of thinking that the wars in the conflicts in either Iraq or Afghanistan, which were principally counterinsurgency based fights, would be the new paradigm for war, I think both of these conflicts have again shifted us back to the understanding that great power competition and nation-state war is the real paradigm for war in the next 10 to 20 years. But nonetheless, I am concerned that the scale and the scope of future war is the vital concern here. That I believe that the future war of both continental Europe potentially, and certainly the South and East China Seas, could pose an existential risk to both military forces and civilian populations on a far greater scale than what we've seen currently in Eastern Europe or the Near and Middle East. And so I think that occasions our discussion of these now in a way that helps us think about those ahead of time. What do I hope people will take away from this book? Let me just move toward a close by saying I hope folks will have a new understanding of moral and spiritual injury across a nation broadly, and yet how we can mitigate their impact through collective reaffirmation of core values, principles, and beliefs. In essence, I don't believe that it is an unfruitful exercise for either an individual or for certainly a nation to go through the question of assessing what do I or what do we believe? What are we willing to literally defend if called into question? All I think success in terms of war, if one can say that war has generative outcomes, begin at least with an affirmation of the reasons for entering conflict in the first place. Secondly, I hope people will take away a new understanding and commitment that in a very real sense, we own the profession of arms. And so I hope to spark a renewed civil military dialogue around democracy and war. I will say I can't, even though I was a guest in the United Kingdom for only 12 months, I can't really comment on that in that context. But I can say in the American context, there's a very real sense in which the profession of arms is sort of out of sight, out of mind. When America moved to the all-volunteer force in July of 1973, We shifted the American way of war away from a conscript-based force and a militia-based force that could be called on in time of need, to a standing professional force that would in perpetuity secure the interests of the nation. And yet there have been derivative opportunity costs of that move to the what's called the all volunteer force now. And that is that you have people like my friend who recently retired and was awarded an award for valor back at West Point. When he retired from the military, he had 13 acknowledged deployments to Iraq or Afghanistan over a course of just over 20 years. And that has an immense impact not only on him and his family, but also obviously on the nation. I contend that our understandings and our sensitivities around moral and spiritual injury can and should help us spark a new dialogue within our democratic nation states about what it means to have a profession of arms in this contemporary day and age. Obviously, I would hope that people also take away, if need be, a new understanding of how either they or their family might be suffering from these, because I believe often that one of the first casualties of war is perspective. And fresh concepts then in language perhaps may lead to a renewed perspective and genuine hope for people. I've certainly been encouraged by the responses of some people who have said this has helped them understand either themselves or their families or others with whom they've been in relationship, and their experiences in the past. And finally, I do hope to spark a new incorporation of these kinds of concepts and thinking, at least dialogue about, into the ad bellum national security decision-making process. The time to talk about the effects of moral and spiritual injury on certainly the individual warrior and his or her family, but also communities, nation states, at the social, the communal level, to me is not only after war, but also critically before war. We should be, I think, in incorporating these kinds of concepts into our dialogue, again, about what are the opportunity costs we will entail long after the conflict has ceased, long after the fighting has ceased. And I think that we're already seeing, by the way, in certainly on the ground in Ukraine and in Gaza and in other places where fighting has been most intense, there's going to be immense economic cost. But what about the moral and the emotional, the ethical, the spiritual cost of cleaning up for these wars, which for many of these peoples will go on for decades? Are we prepared to pay that? I think that we should be discussing those things prior to initiating conflict. Finally, in summary, before we move to Q&A, let me just say that I know many people are concerned about this issue of technology and war, and I think the issue, they're tangential or causal relationship to human worth, not tangential. Other thinkers and theorists of war have touched on this. George Marshall, the great American general, Napoleon. I mean, others have talked about this, but I know that this is coming to the fore again because of the rapid integration of artificial intelligence and technological systems into battlefield fighting. And so my own consideration is that from the book, I believe that we can't reduce our estimation of warriors and family members, and certainly our citizens, to only a consequentialist rendering of their utility. And by that, what I mean is this. I began to troublingly see in the profession of arms, particularly toward the latter third of my career, that leaders were routinely, without perhaps even realizing it, beginning to think about the worth of a soldier, individual soldier, only in what they could do for the profession of arms or in the profession of arms. I want to contend that those people have worth far beyond simply any task that they might perform. They are people of inherent worth simply by virtue of their existence. And I believe the Judeo-Christian tradition, in terms of the rich concept of being made in the image of God, helps us begin to speak about that. And then derivatively, by refocusing the profession's discussion here, I think that helps us help the profession place a high value on the temporal and eternal worth of every person. Scholars about moral injury will say that one of the things that, and certainly post-traumatic stress disorder will say, that one of the things that is a red flag, particularly for critical cases of PTSD, is moral or emotional numbness, right? So I think by focusing our understanding of moral and spiritual injury and perhaps expanding them to how they impact us as entire population sets and societies, we can help our nations maintain a social, moral, and ethical sensitivity, and thus derivatively raise the bar on any future nation state decision to go to war.